Hello, welcome to this next video about the Norman Conquest. Now remember, Norman Conquest course can be split into 5 major debates. This is part 5. Make sure you've watched all the others as well, and you've got to have your own opinions and prepared to make arguments about each of these going into the exam. So what is part 5 all about? Well, this is the very end of the course when we assess what impact had the Normans had. So we could think about it with these kinds of questions. Was the impact of the Norman conquest negative for England? It might ask you to think about the Norman yoke, and we'll discuss that again just in a moment. So is the idea of the Norman yoke valid? Is it true? Is it accurate? Or is it a myth? And it can also include this section, a question about whether the Normans did transform England. So it might not necessarily be about positive and negative. You could be asked about to what extent you think they changed, transformed the country. So I think this is a great question, lots of great evidence, lots of great things we can talk about. So let's have a look at some of the key things. Just before we do that, I think worth just reminding you about what we mean by this Norman yoke idea. It's a really important one for you to make sure you're clear about and to have an opinion on. So the Norman yoke, it's not a fact, it's an interpretation. So it's a belief that some people have. So we need to question it. And basically it's the idea that the Normans came to England and treated the English very badly, taking away their freedoms and ruining the country. So the yoke is the thing we can see that have been put around the farming animals' heads in this picture. That is what a yoke is. So the Norman yoke, it's not literally that the Normans came and put this kind of thing around the English, but metaphorically it means that they controlled the English, they didn't allow the English to have freedoms, and that in general they kind of abused them, used them for their own benefits, just like a farmer would use an animal. So let's go through a little summary then of the arguments that this video is going to then go into a bit more detail on. So let's frame this around the question, is the idea of the Norman yoke valid? So let's look at some reasons why we could say, yes, it's true, the Norman yoke did happen, this is what it was like. We could say, well, yeah, the Normans took over nearly all of the land. Key statistic, 95% of the land by 1086. And land ownership equals wealth and power. So it's basically saying the Normans took all of the money, they took all of the power, and therefore, yes, they must have the English in a yoke, they must be treating the English badly, because the English now no longer have any money or any real power. We could say that there were lots of English people treated very badly, and a key example is the harrying of the North. There were lots of harsh laws and punishments, for example, the Forest Law. So this is about controlling people and limiting their freedoms. The English were angry with the Normans. There was loads of rebellions, and we look at a few of the most important ones, but those aren't just the only ones. There were people rebelling or not wanting to follow Norman rule all over the country. And the fact that they felt so angry and upset with the Normans is kind of proof for some people that this idea of a Norman yoke is true, right? That the people weren't happy. Why aren't they happy? Well, because they don't like the Normans. The Normans are treating them badly and not welcome in England. And finally, there's an argument which links back to our key question number 1 about was Anglo-Saxon England a golden age. There's some people that believe that before 1066 women had lots of rights, and that after the Normans kind of took those away, and over time women's rights were diminished. So there's a summary of some arguments to say, yeah, Norman yoke, it's true, and they're basically exactly the same arguments for if the question said, is it true that the Normans were bad for England or brought negative consequences? So what's the flip side of the arguments? Well, some people argue the Normans actually changed some things for the better. A great example of that is getting rid of slavery. Over time, the new laws and structures created greater stability and wealth for the country. You could argue that life was only made worse for richer people, and that most normal people's lives weren't that different after 1066 compared to before. And it kind of links to the final point here. England wasn't that great before, you could argue. You could say it wasn't a golden age. For example, there was all this kind of corrupt religion. And if England's not that great before, then you can't exactly say the Normans come and ruin it, because there's nothing really to ruin. Now, to be clear, these are all just arguments, as is everything in these debate videos. So none of there's facts here, of course, but the opinion, the interpretation is up to you and other people to develop. So we're going to go through some of these in a bit more detail. We're going to start with the arguments which suggest the Normans were bad. There was a Norman yoke. England was damaged by the Normans. And just from these two images, we can get a good sense of some of the key things. Of course, the Normans built castles all over England. Why did they build castles? Well, they want to control the English people. Who builds these castles? Well, English people are forced to build them, basically as slaves. And we can see the bottom picture, English peasants, churls, working the land, and it's the Norman that's going to benefit. It's the Norman that's going to take taxes and actually get rich from all of the work of the English. So what is our evidence then for saying, yes, the Normans were very negative for England? Well, always try and remember this, this graph in your memory here. Who owns the land? 95% of the land is owned by Normans 20 years after the Battle of Hastings and the Norman Conquest. But they only make up 1% of the population. So that leads lots of people to think, well, hang on a minute, what was going on here? How can 1% own 95% of land? There must be control, there must be violence, there must be fear. But also, all the people that owned the land before have really lost out here. So yes, it's true that English people lost out for the Normans' benefits, therefore the Normans were negative for England. In addition to just land ownership, William raises high taxes, and he uses this not to make the country better, but to pay for his army, which is basically occupying the country, for building castles, which are there to control the English people, and just to give profits for his followers, to reward the fellow Normans who had helped him take over England. So none of this high taxes is going back in to help the English people or to help England. And we can see, we've got some statistics here, that Norman landowners got really rich. They increased the income by around 30% between 1066 and 1086. So the Normans are getting rich, the English are getting poor. A key argument for suggesting, yes, the Normans were bad, yes, there was a Norman yoke. Furthermore, why else could we argue they were bad for England? Well, land and lives are destroyed across England, but especially in a large area of the north during the harrying of the north. This awful event, which we think about more in debate question 3, this harrying of the north can also be used here, because if we're asking, are the Normans good or bad for England? Well, the Normans went across a huge area of land, destroying it, killing a huge amount of people, really ruining people's lives. So that would be a clear argument for saying the Normans were indeed negative and bad for England. Communities are destroyed, particularly in the north, but in other areas too. Number of casualties are high. Of course, lots of English people had died in the Battle of Hastings and in all of the other rebellions and acts of conquest that followed. Many people are forced to leave their homes. This is not a good time for English people, you could argue. Further reasons, well, we could say that everything from who could hunt or fish to how and where markets are run is controlled by Normans. English people are living in their country, but they have no freedoms. It's these foreign people that have come over and are telling them, controlling them, and if people don't follow these, then the punishments are really harsh. Now, this quote comes from someone writing just after the Norman Conquest, but it comes from about 850 years ago. This quote says, "The English groaned aloud for their lost liberty." We do have lots of evidence that the English people just weren't happy. And that's a really convincing, for me, argument that the Normans were bad, the Normans were negative. A few specific facts and key words here. So the Normans introduced very unpopular, damaging laws. The forest law, which controls who can hunt in royal forests, and then the murderum fine, which is all about punishing the whole community until a criminal was caught. these are really damaging, very unpopular laws, but the English people can do nothing about them. And indeed, those people that are caught or blamed by the Norman officials are punished really harshly. We have punishments like gouging eyes out, cutting fingers off, really harsh punishments meted out by the Normans. Again, the English don't really have any say over this. And then finally, for this kind of idea, we've got churls, the peasants having to work for Norman lords, often in bad conditions, whether this be building a castle or farming. Not officially slaves. Normans did get rid of slavery officially, but it's kind of like they're being slaves here. And finally, I forgot this last little bit. Women's rights are argued to be lost. Okay, so women did have, by law, more rights before the Normans than they do after. So all of that sounds really bad, and I think it is. I think there's a lot of valid arguments there for saying the Normans were bad, Norman yoke is true. However, it's important to think about the flip side as well. There are lots of people that are convinced that actually maybe that's a little bit exaggerated or too one-sided what we've just gone through. So like it says here, sure, the Normans certainly brought some oppression and control. No one is saying that they were absolute angels. But the arguments are that, number one, life for working peasants, which is the majority of the population, didn't change that much day to day. The normal English person, their life before 1066 and their life after 1066 isn't that different, you could argue. And therefore, to say there's some kind of Norman yoke or that the Normans destroy England can be seen to be an over-exaggeration. As we'll come on to in a moment, there are arguments to say that the Normans actually introduced some good things that improved England. And finally, and this depends on your opinion about whether there was a golden age or not, there's certainly an argument to suggest that things weren't that great before. England wasn't some kind of incredible paradise before 1066. So to say the Normans came and ruined things is kind of mythologizing, being too romantic, too positive about England before the Normans. So let's go through into a few of those arguments in a tiny bit more detail. So here we are now on the side of arguing the Normans were not that negative for England. So one really good piece of evidence, although there are counter-arguments as we've already explored, is to say that the Normans did not use slavery. When they took over England, they started to get rid of the practice and the numbers of enslaved people fell. There were around 10% of people that lived in a kind of slavery before 1066, so getting rid of that is clearly a good thing. The Normans transformed religion in England. They built huge cathedrals, like the picture we can see here at the bottom right, which is Salisbury Cathedral, and these were much more impressive than anything seen in the country before. Religion becomes a bit more respected, a bit more in line with the rest of Europe, and many people say that religion was kind of corrupt before, and now the Normans are improving this really important part of people's lives. And you could argue that the Normans made England more stable and wealthy, particularly in the longer term. I think in the shorter term, this is a much weaker argument. But as it says here, England was not invaded again after the Normans and became one of the most powerful nations in Europe. So some people would say, the Normans made England better. Now, I think if you ask the English people at the time, are you happy? Are the Normans improving your country? They would say no. But if we kind of zone back a little bit, we can see perhaps some longer term improvements. And finally, here are some further arguments to suggest the Normans aren't that bad. After the Norman conquest, farming families still did the same work, ploughing the land, trying to produce a good harvest every day. Their life wasn't great before, their life's not great now. We're not saying the Normans were good for them, but we are saying the Normans were not that negative for them. You could argue that it's a myth that before the Normans, England was ruled by kind of pure and good English rulers. The Normans might not have been great, but nor was what England was like before them. There were Viking rulers, there was kings like Edward the Confessor who got kicked out of the country by his own earls for a time period. There was certain levels of chaos, certain rulers that weren't particularly good for the country. So to say the Normans were really negative is to kind of overlook the fact that other rulers were pretty bad before as well. And there's arguments that some towns actually benefit from increased trading with Normandy and other areas of Europe connected to the Normans. So there are benefits that are brought to England, and again, perhaps over the longer term, rather than the immediate first years after the conquest, we can assess some positive developments. And some people would say that is thanks to the Normans, it wouldn't happen without them, therefore they weren't that negative, and maybe some would even argue they were positive for the country. So let's wrap up this video just by exploring how we would talk about this. Remember, super important to think about this point, evidence explanation, and it's the explanation point which picks you up all the marks. So much better to make one really good point with evidence and explanation than try to do 4, which is just describing what happened. So let me illustrate to you what a good paragraph would look like here. Our points. So the question is, the idea of the Norman yoke is just a myth. Do you agree? So I've said I disagree with this statement because the Normans made life worse for the majority of English people, especially by taking away their land and wealth. That's my point. Now I need to give some evidence. By 1086, Normans owned 95% of all English land despite being just 1% of the population. They had gotten very rich from taxing the English, whilst English people generally got poorer, as can be seen in the Domesday Book. Now, lots of people might just leave their answer like that, and they're not going to pick up a good high grade just for that. You've got to explain, why does this prove that the idea of the Norman yoke is not a myth? The Normans would not have been able to take all this land unless they used violence and control over the English, who made up 99% of the country. Whilst this affected richer English people the most, poorer people suffered too through high taxes. Therefore, the Normans were clearly cruel and damaging for the English people. And I can't read the bottom line because that's where my video is covering. So you can read that there, proving that the Norman yoke is not a myth. Okay, well done for listening. Make sure you've watched all the other ones. See you next time.